It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Levick, talking to us about what happens to the separation of church and state. Mark is a graduate of Indiana University with a BS from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, which means government, and then from Indiana University School of Law. After practicing law in the area of mergers and acquisitions and tax for more than 13 years, he moved to California and began teaching American government at Pierce College in Woodland Hills, and enjoyed teaching much more than practicing law. The following year, he began teaching current events, and today his American government classes, he teaches 4 current event classes each week, including a class in the summer on the U.S. Supreme Court, which are the classes that I've taken from him, and they've always been fascinating. And that really relates to the topic for today. And so, Mark, thank you for joining us from home on Zoom with the sniffles. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you all here today. When I wrote the topic, it was whatever happened to that wall of separation between church and state. And then I said, well, I should probably say something about what can we do to repair that wall. And so first, I'll talk about some of the difficulties, those of us who are First Amendment supporters, but not supporters of everyone being able to, say, get government funding for their religion. So what can we do to help people like me who want everyone to be able to worship as they choose, but at the same time don't want to pay through, say, tax dollars for other people to worship? So I'll go through a couple of the cases that I find interesting over the last several years. And I want to start off by looking at the First Amendment itself. It's very brief, nice and short. Amendment number 1, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech. And then it continues with the press, etc. But those are the relevant portions for today. So Congress in 1787, when the Constitution is written, is prohibited from interfering with our free exercise of religion and is prohibited from establishing a religion. And you all know your history. The official Church of England caused some of the people to come to the United States in the very beginning. They were seeking religious freedom. That First Amendment doesn't say anything about states or local government, does it? It just says Congress. Throughout our nation's history, the Supreme Court has applied more and more of those amendments, the first 10 amendments. They've applied more of those amendments through incorporation and made them applicable to state and local governments as well. In 1940, the Supreme Court recognized that the Establishment Clause, that the Free Exercise Clause applied to the states. And in 1947, the Supreme Court recognized that the Establishment Clause applied to the states. Before then, state constitutions were the guiding principle when someone was concerned about what their state or local government was up to. Now, since the 1940s, we can look either to our state constitution's protections for religion and free exercise and no establishment, or we can look to the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment for those same or similar protections. Well, it seems pretty simple, right? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Well, easy enough. That means no official church of the United States. And since the 1940s, even if California's Constitution permitted it, there'd be no official church of California. And the Free Exercise Clause, that's where we get into a real quagmire, because the majority, as I tell my young students, always wants to outvote the minority. That's a feature of democracy. Those with the minority view typically lose unless everyone has decided at the beginning that there are rights we're going to safeguard and protect. Well, we've tried to safeguard and protect the freedom of speech and the press and assembly and freedom of religion by enshrining them in this First Amendment so that the majority cannot pass laws that would, a couple of students, let me click mute here. There we go. Over time, states have established their own churches. In the 1770s and 1780s, some of the original states established religion. They provided support to various religions, and not all the states did. Some of the states, though. By the 1830s, all of the states had changed their constitution so that they were no longer in the business of establishing religion. And as far as I know, all of the state constitutions protect religious freedom, the free exercise of one's chosen religion as well. So where did this wall of separation come from? Because when I read the Constitution, I don't see it in there. I've got up on my other screen. If I look slightly away, it's because I'm looking over at my other screen here and not the laptop that has the camera. Back in 1802, 220, almost 3 years ago, January 1 of 1802, President Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association in the state of Connecticut. And in that letter, he said, "Gentlemen, the affectionate sentiments of esteem and approbation, which you are so good as to express toward me on behalf of the Danbury Baptist Association, give me the highest satisfaction. My duties dictate a faithful and zealous pursuit of the interests of my constituents, and in proportion as they are persuaded of my fidelity to those duties, the discharge of them becomes more and more pleasing. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. I reciprocate your kind prayers for the protection and blessing of the common Father and Creator of man, and tender you for yourselves and your religious association assurances of my high respect and esteem." Signed, President Jefferson. Well, from that point on, it was fairly evident, right? One of the founders of our country, President Jefferson, looked at the First Amendment and said that built a wall of separation. We should not have state entanglement in religion. We should not have the state interfering with one's exercise of religion. And yet, even in the post-Revolutionary War era, right before the Constitution was written, some states dabbled in providing, say, funding for education. Right after the American Revolution was concluded, Virginia said, we're going to propose that taxpayers be allowed to designate a portion of their assessment to go to the religion of their choice. And if they're not religious or don't make a designation, then the money will flow to the general fund to provide for money for a seminary for teaching of higher education. And yet James Madison, who helped write the Constitution, said, whoa, no, let's not do that. Nothing good could come from having the state provide money for some religions. That sort of discrimination should not begin. Turn that page. Here we go. Right out in the 1880s, about 1884 or so, Maryland proposed something similar, and there was a backlash as well. Then a few years later, the Constitution was adopted, and 2 years after the Constitution, the first 10 amendments were ratified. Today, about 39 states have limits on providing funding for religion, and those are typically in state constitutions. They provide generally that no state funding will be provided to any religious organization. Those have not been interpreted, however, to prohibit, say, the provision of typical generally provided services. If a religious organization needs the help of the fire brigade or the constable, those services provided to all will be provided. There's no constitutional problem with providing generally provided services and benefits that society provides. Where it gets problematic, of course, is where people want to start providing money for some religions, but not always for all religions. Well, it's no surprise that over the last 17 years or so, our Supreme Court has moved to the pro-religious side. Religions have done very well when they're in front of the Roberts Court. And in fact, I have some data on this. The New York Times did some studying earlier this year and said, if we look at the Earl Warren Court, we go back to Earl Warren because that goes back to the late 40s when states were now subject to the First Amendment's religion clauses. If we go back to 1953 and the Earl Warren Court, religion won 46% of their cases where there were oral arguments in the case. And they did that so that they were excluding those shadow docket cases where there isn't a full briefing and full oral argument. But where it's a complete Supreme Court case, when Earl Warren was Chief Justice, only 46% of the time did the religion side win. In the Warren Burger Court that followed, 51% of the time, religion was victorious. And under the William Rehnquist Court, when he became Chief Justice, that would have been back in about 1980, I think, 5, 6 or so, when William Rehnquist became the Chief Justice. Under his tenure up until 2005, religion won 58% of the time. So there was a slow progression of success where religion was more successful as the ages went by. But you see slow progression. Earl Warren, 46%, Warren Burger, 51%, William Rehnquist, 58%. It's really striking how much things have changed in the last 17 years. Under John Roberts' court since 2005, when he was named Chief Justice, religion has won more than 85% of the time that they have been in front of the court. And again, with full briefing and with full oral arguments. So it's higher than 85% of the time. And most of those victories are not organizations, religious groups saying, hey, you need to get out of the business of religion, government. More and more of those victories appear to be, we welcome government in our religion in various ways, especially if it's providing money. When government's providing money, of course, that is the hallmark of an establishment clause problem in the making. Providing funding to religion, that's something that I think most Americans are going to object, unless, of course, it's their religion. Sometimes principles give way. And I'll mention a couple of those cases. Well, this was not a 2017, 18, 19, 20 problem. This growth in religions winning predates President Trump, although being able to name 3 reliable Christians to the court, President Trump has sort of enshrined and made more firm the religion's grip, where we used to see 5-4 decisions, and sometimes we saw liberals joining the majority, and sometimes we saw conservatives joining the minority. Most of the recent decisions are 5-4 or 6-3, because now the conservative-leaning justices make up 6 of the 9 members of the court. Some of the types of decisions that they've rendered, like I said, in the 1940s, they decided that the First Amendment's religion clauses actually did apply to restrict what states could do. In one of those cases in the 40s, let me see, in 1947, I think it was a New Jersey case. New Jersey, or a local government in New Jersey, was willing to reimburse parents for the public transit cost of getting their children to school. So if the kids rode the subway or the bus, they could get reimbursed. And the local government in New Jersey said that can be for a private religious school or the public school. Doesn't make any difference. And of course, someone said, wait a minute, you're going to give money to parents so they can get their kids to a religious school? Doesn't that violate the Establishment Clause? And the court said, no, that's permissible, because by the 1940s, school buses were in wide use. And in some parts of the country, school buses would take children to school either at no cost or low cost. In other parts of the country, like in Los Angeles, parents were on their own to get their kids to school, unless their child attends a magnet school that's a certain distance away, and then the school provides transportation. But in 1947, the Supreme Court said that doesn't violate the Constitution. Well, across much of the evangelical Christian part of the world, the religious folks wanted the kids not just to go to school on Sunday, but they wanted them, or to go to church on Sunday, but they wanted them to get some additional indoctrination, religious education throughout the middle of the week. And thus was born the school prayer. I have a student in one of my classes who grew up in Pittsburgh. A Jewish woman said she can still recite the Lord's Prayer because she was forced to cite the Lord's Prayer every single day through her K through 12 education. Well, in 1962, the Supreme Court, right after she graduated from high school, in 1962, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't require students in a public school to recite daily prayers. Throughout the remainder of the 60s, the Supreme Court dealt with other attempts to make an end run around that restriction, because they didn't go quietly. There were lots of attempts. Eventually, it morphed into the moment of silence. When I was in school, they turned off the lights in the cafeteria for a minute or 5, and we were expected to pray. We were forbidden to make any sound. If we talked to anyone, we were in big trouble. And we knew what it was all about even when we were in elementary and middle school. They didn't like the fact that we weren't allowed to participate in a big group prayer. School prayer has continued even into the more recent era. In 1992, the Supreme Court ruled against school-sponsored prayer at a high school graduation, where everyone is there to get their diploma. There's really no opting out. And yet someone of the cloth gets up and says, I'd like to lead everyone in prayer. Well, fortunately, the Supreme Court, even in 92, said no. And in 2000, under the Roberts, 2000, that's before Roberts. That's still a Rehnquist decision. In 2000, the Supreme Court invalidated the policy that let students lead pregame prayer at football games, I think in Texas, over a loudspeaker. The school knew they couldn't get up there and have the local minister give the prayer with the principal's okay, but this was the pep squad or the cheerleaders or somebody getting a microphone and a speaker and leading everyone in prayer before the football game. Well, football and prayer are still kind of connected. This past summer, there was a case involving a football coach in Washington state, and he was a deeply religious person, and he didn't just want to pray all by himself. He wanted to pray so that everyone could see him pray. And so at the conclusion of each football game, he would go out to the 50-yard line, kneel down, and give a short prayer. As one expects, his student athletes, people on the football team, sort of joined in. When that case was in the Supreme Court, there was some debate between the conservatives and the more liberal justices as to whether those students were participating completely on their own volition or whether they felt compelled. I think one of the dissenting progressive justices said, when the coach goes out and does that, if you want to get playing time, you might feel compelled to join the coach in the prayer, even though it may not be what you would prefer to do. Well, that was one of the cases in the much more recent era where, of course, religion won out. That case was problematic because there wasn't a real clear set of facts. The facts didn't seem to stay consistent throughout the appellate process. Someone wrote a great op-ed in the Seattle paper saying the Supreme Court didn't seem to be apprised of all the real facts. This was someone who'd been there throughout his tenure as the football coach, and said he was sort of encouraging and maybe compelling the students to join in. And he was a publicity hound as well. When the school fired him or put him on notice that they might fire him if he'd continue these prayers, he went to the media and, got the local version of Fox 11 to show up and be there for the big school prayer that he was not supposed to conduct out on the 50-yard line. And so it, of course, became one of those national media causes that the big Fox network and other more conservative media picked up as, hey, they're trying to prevent this guy from praying. No. Reasonable time, manner, and place restrictions are always the hallmark of the First Amendment. All they didn't want him to do was to pray on the 50-yard line at the conclusion of each game. He could pray anywhere else he wanted, but not there. But those are the sorts of cases that we have seen. There's a case, of course, today, and that is the wedding website designer who wants to create wedding websites, but so far apparently has not done so. She has said that although she is willing to sell services to the LGBTQ community, there's one thing she says that's off limits. She will not design a wedding website for a same-sex wedding. She'll design websites for gay people, she says, just not same-sex couples' marriages. A wedding website's kind of a new thing for me. I got married way back before the interwebs were a thing, but some of the invitations I received in recent years have included a link that I could click on where I can see photographs, I can see information, suggested hotels, all of the schedule, and a strong encouragement to attend if possible. And websites, while not free, are fairly inexpensive to maintain for a limited duration of time like that. But she says her religious beliefs oppose same-sex marriage. She doesn't hate gay people, again, because she'll sell her web services, designing websites to people, no matter if they're gay or not. But if a couple says, I want you to design us a website so that we can celebrate our marriage, that's where she draws the line. Well, the oral arguments are happening this morning, probably concluded by now. It's already 1:30 in the East. But they'd scheduled it, I think, for a couple hours or more, because it is a big sort of decision with lots and lots of friend of the court briefs filed. And not everyone even agrees what the issue is. The pro-religious side says this is not about LGBTQ rights. This is not about same-sex marriage. This is all about her being compelled to speak by government. Forced speech. Generally, government cannot compel you to speak under the First Amendment. That would be a violation of your free speech rights. The part of the First Amendment that says, or abridge your freedom of speech. Well, if government says, Levick, thou shalt say X, that's usually thought to be a problem. The ACLU, head of the ACLU, has an op-ed in today's paper in the New York Times, in which the headline is, the First Amendment is not a license to discriminate. He says, this really isn't a free speech case. This is a case all about discriminating against LGBTQ people. And he warns, if the Supreme Court comes down on her side and says, you're allowed to hold yourself out as an artiste designing websites, because, there is expression of hers. This is art. The graphic design of a website, if I designed it, there wouldn't be any art or free expression. It'd be rudimentary and utilitarian, but that's because I don't know what I'm doing. She, of course, does. She'll make one that's artistic and aesthetically pleasing, something people will want to look at and spend time learning about the betrothed couple. So the supporters of religion say this is all about her being compelled to speak just because she's put out a shingle. And the ACLU, the head of the ACLU, says, no. If you put out a shingle and say, I'm willing to do your nails or do your hair or design a website or make you a cake or any of those services, and I'm willing to sell it to anybody who shows up except a couple who's getting married and is of the same sex, that is the problem, says David Cole of the ACLU. And I'll note, in a really well-written op-ed by one of my favorite lawyers, Dean Chemerinsky, in yesterday's LA Times. Perhaps some of you saw that. The headline on his article was, does the First Amendment protect a right to discriminate? On Monday, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in a case that threatens to open the door widely to businesses being allowed to violate anti-discrimination laws. If the court rules that the First Amendment protects the right of business owners to discriminate based on claims of freedom of speech or free exercise of religion, civil rights laws banning discrimination on the basis of race and sex and religion or sexual orientation will be severely weakened everywhere in this country. Now, there's another case that I haven't mentioned yet that I wanted to mention today. Let me click to that one. And that was a case this past year where Boston, the city of Boston, got it completely wrong. In that case, Boston at their city hall operates some flagpoles, and they invite groups from credit unions to service clubs to sports teams to come for the day and put their flag up on the city's flagpole. There's one for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, one for the United States, and there's one where the Boston flag usually flies. But you can take down the Boston flag if you have permission that day and fly your own flag. In one case, it was a credit union. The Red Sox, they've been fortunate to fly their flag a few times this century. And then there's, a party of sorts, a rally, some sort of meeting on the town square that's outside of the brutalist, ugliest building in the world. I've heard it described, City Hall. It's one of that brutalist architecture from the 1960s, sort of similar to that library down at UC San Diego that Dr. Seuss gave all that money to build. Lots and lots of bare concrete and ugliness. But in this case, an organization, a Christian organization, applied and said, we want to fly our flag. And they provided a sample of the flag. There was the mistake. The Boston people said, oh, we're afraid if we let you fly that flag, someone will think we've established your religion as the religion. Well, they were denied and they went to court. And when the case got to the Supreme Court this past year, in that case, we had a, unanimous decision. It was a unanimous. All 9 of them ruled that no, putting that flag on the flagpole wouldn't make for Boston establishing Christianity as the official religion. After all, any organization can come fly their flag for a couple of hours. But a remarkable quote in here was from Justice Gorsuch. Gorsuch said, what we have here is a city that, acting on some old and almost dead precedent of the United States Supreme Court, decided that it was better to violate this organization's free exercise rights than risk being sued for having established Christianity as the official religion. And so the message from this case and some others was, stop violating people's free exercise rights in the name of trying to avoid Establishment Clause violations, because the free exercise rights appear, at least to me, to take some precedence. Now, the big case that kicked all of this off really was in 2017. And that was a case where a daycare center attached to the Trinity Lutheran Church in Missouri, they wanted to participate in a state program that would give grants to some qualified daycare, preschool operators of playgrounds to put down that new spongy, engineered, shredded tire surface. I believe it's the type that's a poured in place spongy surface. You've seen at some of the playgrounds and parks, I'm sure, here. And in the Missouri Constitution, there was a provision that said, no, you cannot provide this sort of funding to religious organizations. But the church filed its application, and they were the 5th ranked out of 44 applicants. And so they then said, oh, wait a minute, you're connected to a church. You don't get your grant of, I think, $20,000 to help pay. The church was going to raise some money of its own. And the state said, no, sorry, you qualify. In fact, you're ranked number 5 out of 44, but you don't get a grant. At the Supreme Court, the majority, which I believe was 7-2, let's see. Yeah, the majority in that case was 7-2. Only Justices Sotomayor and Ginsburg dissented. That means that Elena Kagan and Justice Breyer were in the majority. So it was a 7-2 where we had some liberals joining the conservatives. And in that case, they said, this is a benefit that the state is willing to provide to all qualified applicants, unless they're part of religion. And the Supreme Court majority said, that's a discrimination against religion. So the dissent, Justice Sotomayor, joined with Justice Ginsburg, said, this threatens to strike down the 39 states' laws or constitutions that provide for no funding for religion. She sounded the alarm. I'm sure we'll see more cases that are similar. So we've gone way beyond having a wall of separation to, well, if a Christian organization wants money from government, These days, it's going to get it. And if a Christian football coach wants to pray at the 50-yard line, nobody's going to stand in his way. So I promised a little bit of what possibly could we do to fix this problem? How could we fight back and rebuild that wall? The glib answer is, of course, some more elections come and go, and some Supreme Court justices come and go, and perhaps the right combination of presidents. Yeah, sure, that could happen. But that's a very long and slow process. I'm going to attack it from the other side, and that's from the fight fire with fire technique. And that's being done on Friday last week. A Marion County Superior Court judge in Indiana granted an order for a preliminary injunction against the new Indiana no abortions except in very limited circumstances case. She says on September 8 of this year, the plaintiffs, anonymous people 1 through 5, including, in addition to those anonymous plaintiff individuals, an organization called Hoosier Jews for Justice, filed a complaint challenging the new anti-abortion law under Indiana's Religious Freedom Restoration Act. That's the law that I believe was part of Pence's legacy while he was still governor of Indiana. Let me turn real quick to a description here on page 8. Abortion and religious practice. She discusses Judaism. Under Jewish law, a fetus attains the status of a living person only at birth, when the greater part emerges from the mother. And then she cites to the rabbis who provided that in their depositions. Prior to that time, the fetus is considered as part of the woman's body, not having a life of its own or independent rights. In order to protect the woman, Jewish law recognizes that there are circumstances in which abortion should occur and is mandated even if there is not a physical health risk that is likely to cause death or the substantial and irreversible physical impairment to a woman's major bodily function. For example, Judaism recognizes that an abortion should be allowed if necessary to protect the mother's mental anguish that could arise from severe physical or mental health issues. Judaism allows for and requires that an abortion be provided if the pregnancy threatens the woman's mental health. And all of these things are not quite to the standard that Indiana now requires for women to obtain an abortion. She also then discusses in other paragraphs the same or similar mandates in Islam, in the Unitarian Universalism, in paganism, and in the Episcopalian religion as well. And so then she discusses the various plaintiffs. Well, I say, like I said before, let's fight fire with fire. Let's find the folks whose religious free exercise rights are being impaired or abridged by the laws that are being passed. The Christians have done really well in much of the country, alleging that their rights of free expression have been abridged. Now it's time to turn the tables and find those who are definitely in a smaller group whose rights are being violated. Lastly, there was a statistic in one of my readings that said when President Obama was elected, 55% of the country was still white Christians. Today, it's only about 45% or so. And so things are declining slowly. Yeah, white Christians were 54% of the population in 2008, now only about 45% of the population. And so nobody's a majority in that setting, but some religious organizations are still in a very distinct minority and are at risk of being outvoted so that the plurality can embark on their let's abolish abortion because somehow other people doing what they want to do with their doctors and their mental and physical health somehow impairs our religious freedom, which I don't quite understand. So I think the solution is find the right arguments, go to court and make the arguments. Maybe you'll win on some of those. The Indiana Supreme Court has taken up the cases with against the Indiana abortion law sometime in January. But other than winning some elections and getting different judges appointed, I think the better solution is, at least in the interim, let's find the ways to throw their legal theories right back at them. I'm hoping that in the case involving the website producer, I'm hoping that the UCLA or that the ACLU and Dean Chemerinsky prevail, because otherwise all sorts of rights are at risk. If those putting out a shingle can say, well, wait a minute, I'm not going to take your photograph. You want me to photograph your same-sex wedding? I'm not going to bake you a cake. I'll bake everybody else a cake, but not your wedding cake. What next? A hotel that says, we welcome our same-sex couples unless it's for their honeymoon or their wedding. That strikes at the heart of our public accommodations laws. Well, I think that's the time I have today. Let me go here and see if we have any questions that I can see. Looking for the chat room. Well, did anyone put questions in chat? I'm having trouble locating it on my screen here. Chat, here we go. Let me look real quick. Is she required to do a good job? If one were doing something for someone they did not want to work for, they could do a poor job and soon the market would stop hiring them for that service. If the site is not acceptable to the couple and not published, it would not hurt her reputation much at all. Interesting. I think that's the question that we had in chat. The problem is if word gets out that that some customers will get top quality work and same-sex wedding customers will get subpar inferior work, the word may get out, and that might harm her business generally. Of course, there's always the possibility that those sharing her religious beliefs will flock to her, as often is the case, because she's willing to discriminate against certain couples, and they might view that as a real benefit. Anybody have any questions by raising your virtual hand, or those who are in person have a question?
Yeah, Mark, we have a couple questions in the room. Why don't you come up here, and, if you don't mind, so Mark can hear you.
Mark, doesn't this current case lead to the possibility of a hotel saying, we don't accept Jewish guests? Yeah. I mean,
I think it certainly does.
Or black guests or Hispanic. It's got tremendous.
Please repeat the question. We couldn't hear him.
Doesn't this current case that they're arguing today have ramifications for, say, hotel guests? Could they discriminate against Jewish guests if it was their religion to do so, or African American guests? And I think that's the big problem. The big problem is to allow her to discriminate means it might open the door to allowing an awful lot of religion-based discrimination, and that's scary.
Question in regard to the synagogue in Newport made a big deal when we visited there about communication from George Washington. Did that have anything to do with religious discrimination?
I don't know. I'm unfamiliar with that.
Okay, is there another question? Yes. Go ahead.
Again, we don't hear anyone other than you.
Yeah,
Come in the front.
you need to get right near the TV.
How is our being able to donate to synagogues and take that off of our taxes? How is that not getting rid of?
The Supreme Court has allowed states and the federal government to grant tax exemptions, property tax, income tax exemptions, and even donations to all sorts of charitable organizations, as long as the deduction is as long as the deduction is available to all donations, then there's no religious clause problem. If the government were to say, you are allowed to deduct from your taxes gifts to the Christian church or the Catholic church or the Muslim church, but not to your synagogue, there would be the discrimination problem.
Well, and that's your argument for how you're going to solve this, which is to have, for us to say abortion is within our religious beliefs, right?
And it looks as though these are sincerely held beliefs. The judge in Marion County, Indiana said these are sincere religious beliefs that the Jewish faith at some of the time requires an abortion and certainly permits an abortion. And so if that person is not allowed to freely exercise their religion, then that ought to get the attention of Justice Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Baird and all the others, because they seem to be pretty sensitive to religious people not being allowed to freely exercise their religion. That view seems to underpin a lot of their recent victories for religion. You should be able to freely exercise your religion, even if it looks to others like maybe it's an establishment problem.
I have a question.
Joe, go ahead.
Yes. Is there a difference between, getting back to the Supreme Court case right now, is there a difference between the extent to which a provider wants to make available their service, in other words, limit what their talents are, quote unquote, and the discrimination? Because that person is doing what they believe in as their belief, not necessarily meant as a discrimination against anyone.
Well, the fellow at the ACLU, and I think Dean Chemerinsky, answered that by saying she's free as an artist to only do the work she wants to do. But if the work she wants to do is designing wedding websites, then she can't pick and choose which wedding websites she's going to create. I think one of them makes an argument that Annie Leibovitz just takes the pictures she wants to take. That's her art. And sometimes rich patrons will find an artist and commission a work that's to their individual specs. But they said if Annie Leibovitz wanted to open up an art studio at the mall or a photography studio at the mall, then she would have to take all comers who showed up with the money. And she couldn't discriminate and say, wait a minute, you're a same-sex couple. I'm not taking your picture. And so it sounds glib when these writers, both Dean Chemerinsky and Mr. Cole, say, you know, she's not being compelled to create websites. She could just not create wedding websites if she wants to not have to. If she wants to not create wedding websites for LGBTQ couples, then all she has to do is not create wedding websites. If she creates websites for everything except weddings, that would solve her problem, because now there wouldn't be, you know, she put a big sign on the door that says, I don't do wedding websites, not for straight couples, not for gay couples. And then problem solved. It's when she says, I'm going to hang my shingle out there and do wedding websites. It's no different than my barber saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm not cutting your hair. There's some characteristic about you, Levick, that says I'm not cutting your hair. If you're going to go in business and hold yourself out to the public as a provider of service, then just like the rib place, you know, down in the South in the 1950s and 1960s that didn't want to comply with the public accommodations laws, if you're going to sell barbecue, you have to sell barbecue to everybody. You can't pick and choose which customers you're going to take care of. But if you're a restaurant that has a big, broad menu, government can't make you sell barbecue. So she doesn't have to provide wedding websites. She could say, I'm going to provide all the websites in the spectrum other than wedding websites. And then she couldn't be compelled to produce wedding websites for the same-sex couple.
Well, just another take on that. What if the person says, I don't have the proper understanding of the same-sex wedding venue setup or whatever. And I don't feel that the person would say that they do not feel that they are properly experienced to do justice to the couple and do the right job for them.
Interesting. That might be a winning argument in front of our current Supreme Court. I don't, since I'm not an LGBTQ community person, I don't know what it takes to put on a successful LGBTQ wedding or website or pictures or whatever. But that's going to not depend on my religion. That's going to be a self-assessment of my lack of experience in that type of business. I don't know. That sounds like it could be a winner, especially in front of our current court. There's one more question. There's one more question I see in the chat here that says, how far would this religious freedom go with respect to corporations, LLCs, et cetera? The Hobby Lobby case. The Hobby Lobby company, of course, is a corporation, but its main shareholders, I think it's a family-controlled company, are all very religious. And of course, they were freed from the need to provide the contraception services that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, required. And that makes, of course, a lot of people upset. I'm one of the rare people, though, who is a fan of Citizens United. You know, the case that many of you will say, wait a minute, corporations aren't people. They don't have First Amendment rights. They papered over that in Citizens United, Justice Kennedy did, by saying corporations are a group of people, you know, who want limited liability, and groups of people still have First Amendment freedom of speech rights and freedom of religion rights. So that isn't going to be a popular view most of the time to the people I talk to, but I think it may be the correct view. But like I said, never a popular one. But that means that even corporations and LLCs will be able to discriminate based on their religious freedom. In order for them to freely exercise their religion, they're going to be able to discriminate, even though Mr. Cole and Dean Chemerinsky don't like it. Well, we've hit 11 o'clock. I don't see any other questions. I want to thank everyone. Excellent questions. I wish I could answer them better. I'm rarely able to do that.
Thank you, Mark, so much for joining us via Zoom with your cold, and not getting us infected or us getting you infected. Thank you very much again. And hopefully we will be able to call on you again in the future to learn more about our Supreme Court and its machinations.
I'd be honored.
Thank you.